The unquestionable pioneer in the investigation of the Sao Paulo Forum phenomenon was the Sao Paulo-based lawyer Jose Carlos Graca Wagner, a man of exceptional intelligence who honored me greatly with his friendship. He was already speaking on the subject with a keen understanding of its historical and strategic importance around 1995 when I first met him. By 1999, the documentation he had been collecting on the origin and activities of the entity filled an entire room of his house, and proof of the intellectual rigor of the researcher was that only then did he feel ready to begin writing a book on the matter. At the time, he invited me to assist him in the endeavor, but I was about to depart for Romania, and, with great sadness, I declined the invitation. Even greater was the sadness I experienced years later, when, upon resuming contact with Dr. Wagner, I learned that the project had been interrupted by a sudden and uncontrollable wave of financial setbacks and legal battles, which ultimately ruined the health of my friend and his wife, both already elderly. I cannot rid myself of the suspicion that the dangerous investigation he had undertaken had something to do with the sudden collapse of a professional career until then marked by success and prosperity. He had business in the U.S., and it was also there, in the libraries and archives of Miami and Washington, D.C., that he gathered most of the material on the forum. In recent years, the research had taken a peculiar turn. Dr. Wagner hoped to find evidence of an intimate connection between the Sao Paulo Forum and a prestigious American chic left entity, the Inter-American Dialogue. I don't know whether that specific proof exists or not, nor whether it is truly necessary to demonstrate something that half of America already knows through other and abundant signs, namely, that the loudest leaders of the Democratic Party are notorious protectors of revolutionary and terrorist movements, so that the forum, if added to the list, would not significantly alter the biographies of those vampiric figures. What I do know is that the beginning of my friend's personal downfall dates approximately from an interview he gave to Diario Las Americas, an important Spanish-language publication in Miami, in which he spoke about the Sao Paulo Forum and its dangerous ties to the dialogue. But that would already be subject for another investigation, and far be it from me to explain obscurum per obscurius. Even without being able to promise a solution to that particularly enigmatic aspect of the problem, I can guarantee one thing. The archives of Dr. Wagner, recently made available to the research team of Media Sem Mascara and the Sao Paulo Commercial Association, through the generosity of Jose Roberto Valente Wagner, allow us to resume the investigation with the hope that, within a year, we will at least have the internal history of the Sao Paulo Forum reconstructed practically month by month. Then it will be possible to place the matter of the dialogue on firmer footing. But before that, it is necessary to solve another enigma, far more urgent and much closer to us. I shall formulate that enigma by contrasting two sets of facts. First, the Sao Paulo Forum is the largest political organization that has ever existed in Latin America and, without a doubt, one of the largest in the world. All the leftist rulers of the continent participate in it. But it is not just another leftist organization. It gathers over 100 legal parties and several criminal organizations linked to drug trafficking and the kidnapping industry, such as the FARC and the Chilean MIR, all engaged in a common strategic coordination and the pursuit of mutual advantages. Never has the world seen, on such a gigantic scale, such an intimate, persistent, organized, and lasting coexistence between politics and crime. Second, for 16 years, all the newspapers, TV channels, and radio stations in this country, all of them, without exception, including those that most boasted of excelling in investigative journalism and courageous exposés, stubbornly refused to report on the existence and activities of this organization, despite the repeated warnings I sent them on the matter, in every possible and imaginable tone. From solicitous notice to insulting provocation, from humble pleas to the most persuasive logical arguments, everything was in vain. When they did not respond with disdainful silence, they did so with evasive trivialities, with entirely a priori skeptical objections that dismissed any examination of the subject, with most learned remarks about my mental health, or with the stupidest and most puerile mockery one can imagine. In response to this persistent denial of the facts, I published in the electronic newspaper Media Sem Mascara the nearly complete minutes of the assemblies and working groups of the Sao Paulo Forum. The massive documentary evidence proved unable to sway the deniers. They seemed hypnotized, stupefied, mentally paralyzed in the face of a hypothesis more dreadful than their brains could bear at the time. The Sao Paulo Forum brings together over 100 legal parties and several criminal organizations linked to drug trafficking and the kidnapping industry, such as the FARC and the Chilean MR. The publication of the minutes, however, had two important consequences. On one hand, the forum's official website Superscript 3 was hastily taken offline, only to return months later in a much more purged version. On the other hand, among journalists and political analysts, the affectation of disdain for the subject gave way to open, public denial of the very existence of the Sao Paulo Forum. Two individuals stood out especially in that dirty little job: the Englishman Kenneth Maxwell and the Brazilian Luiz Felipe de Alencastro. To announce to the world the complete non-existence of the entity I was denouncing, both, ironically, professional historians, used as their platform or megaphone the podium of the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, the most powerful American think tank, thus giving willful ignorance, or grotesque lying, the endorsement of considerable authority. Anyone still harboring illusions about the intellectual reliability of the academic profession, even when exercised in the so-called great centers. Alencastro is a professor at the University of Paris, and Maxwell is the chief consultant to the CFR itself on Brazilian affairs, may be cured of that affliction by simply taking note of these facts. But at that point, the hypothesis of mere organized ignorance begins to give way to the suspicion of a conscious scheme far greater than our paranoia could have imagined. Important members of the CFR had close contacts with the criminal organizations participating in the Sao Paulo Forum, whose existence, therefore, they could not be unaware of. See my article Behind the Subversion on this matter. In short, Brazil seemed to be trapped in the meshes of a criminal network that involved, at once, the entirety of Latin American leftist parties, the bulk of the National Press Corps, the main drug trafficking gangs on the continent, and, finally, a not insignificant portion of the American political and financial elite. The gravity of these facts is measured by the breadth and persistence of their concealment. Growing in secrecy, the Sao Paulo Forum became the main driving force behind historical transformations on the continent, while the general ignorance about it caused public debate, and thus the entirety of cultural life, to drift further and further from reality and turn into an engineering of alienation, further favoring the growth of a power scheme that fed itself joyfully on its own invisibility. The precipitous decline in public awareness under such conditions was not only predictable but inevitable. Circulating opinions became a grotesque dance of irrelevancies, evasions, and massive errors, while violence and corruption grew before the stunned eyes of the public and of opinion makers, each clinging to the most disconnected, untimely, and powerless explanations. Many decades will have to pass before the psychological devastation resulting from this scenario can be reversed. The astounding chain of crimes that brought it about has no parallel in universal history. One of the most grotesque aspects of the situation is the ease with which the guilty escape any attempt at denunciation by labeling it a conspiracy theory. But who spoke of conspiracy? What we are witnessing is a gigantic movement of resources, powers, organizations, and historical currents, which, in order to remain immune to public curiosity, does not need to hide in basements. It only needs to bet on the public's inability to grasp its ungraspable complexity and to believe in the existence of such highly organized malice. The Forum is a sui generis entity, without counterpart in any age or country. Long after it has been extinguished, as I hope it will be one day, it will still remain an enigma and a challenge to the discernment of historians. For us, it is more than that. It is the omnipresent and invisible enemy dreamed of by Antonio Gramsci.